All too often during election campaigns, the emphasis is on the horse race. Who's ahead, who's behind, and so on. The party system invites such speculation because it's aggregating the views of the electorate, supposedly that is. That was certainly the theory, but in this time of polarizing politics, do the parties still effectively capture the political distinctions they're meant to? Let's ask. In our nation's capital, Erin Kelly. She's the CEO of Advanced Symbolics, Inc., who's been interpreting what Polly, the artificial intelligence analyst, is finding out there. Andrew Coyne is here. He's a columnist with the National Post. And Tony Keller, editorial page editor of the Globe and Mail. And it's good to see you two gents back here in our studio. Polly's mom, good to see you in the nation's capital again.
Hello.
I want to start by reading something that the Globe and Mail editorialized just a few days ago, and it had this paragraph in it. Canada is fortunate that our politics, although marked by highly polarizing rhetoric, features main parties whose policies are mostly not radically different. Canadian politics is still playing out, for now, in gaps measured in feet and inches. Meanwhile, much of the rest of the world has moved to a political metric system where partisan distances are computed in megameters. Let us count our blessings. Tony, who wrote that?
That would be me.
Yes,
Mr.
it would
Bacon.
be. It would indeed. How certain are you that Canada's moderate political culture is not under threat from forces of radicalization?
Oh, yeah, that's a very good question, because I'm not certain it is not under threat. That's right. That description that you just read is a description of things as they are. It is certainly not a prediction of things as they will remain forever.
Well, because you did say in here, for now.
Yeah.
So that's, do you see it changing under your very eyes right now?
Well, look, it's conceivable it can change, but in this current election, at least as between the two main parties, there isn't a heck of a lot of daylight. There are differences, there are shadings, but it's not as if we're dealing with, two radically different main competing political parties in the Conservatives and the Liberals. There's a lot of similarity there.
And you regret that, don't you?
I'm not sure if it's good or bad in and of itself. I think you want some differences between the parties. You want the differences to reflect actual differences within the population, and you want the differences to reflect actual significant disagreements among policymakers about what the best way to go ahead. So if there are, in fact, those differences, it'd be nice to see them reflected. I'm not averse to even radical differences. I think there's a distinction to be drawn between radicalism and extremism. Medicare was a radical idea. Free trade was a radical idea. There's nothing wrong with it being radical if you've thought it through, if you're arguing from facts, if you could be persuaded by contrary facts, if you feel the need to persuade other people to bring them over to your point of view. But the nature of extremism is it dispenses with all that. I simply believe something and you have to believe it whether I persuade you or not. That's what you want to avoid. That's what we're seeing in a lot of other countries. I agree with Tony, we're less likely to see that in Canada for reasons we can get into, but I agree for now, it's looking like we're maintaining a reasonably civil type of politics.
All right, Erin, let's get you in here. And before I ask you to sort of take us through the list of what the main issues you're finding out there are so far and how strongly Canadians feel about them, I always like to do this because what you're into is really pretty cutting edge, and I'm not sure everybody knows what it is. So remind us about who Polly is and what she does.
Polly is our artificial intelligence, and what Polly's able to do, she gets a large sample of Canadians, in this case 270,000 Canadians across the country, and she tracks them longitudinally over the course of a year, and in this case she is comparing 2015 to 2019 and looking to see what Canadians are saying today and how that compares to how they felt 4 years ago in our last federal election.
Now, one thing I found interesting, and I think you just put this out the other day, is, and again, this is before we get into the specific issues, you found a much more significant level of engagement by Canadians in these early days of the campaign compared to 4 years ago. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. We're seeing more than twice the number of Canadians engaging on political issues across every age group in this election compared to the last election. And interestingly enough, the conversations are much more negative than they were in 2015. So if 2015 was the election of sunny ways, I would say that this is the election of cloudy days.
Sunny ways versus cloudy days. Okay, got it. Let's go through, because you've told us ahead of time here, you've given us a bit of a chart on what some of the main issues are. So let's go through them one by one. Here we go. Here's our director, Sheldon Osmond, bringing these up. And number 5 on your list is cost of living. What's Polly having to say about that?
Well, what's interesting about cost of living is that we are seeing it as a partisan issue. It used to be in the past that all Canadians generally agreed that we needed to have programs for low-income Canadians, and they agreed as to what those programs should be. Now we're seeing particularly people on the right, conservative voters, saying, wait a minute, I don't consider my family to be low income, and yet we're worried. And so those programs that we had in the past for low-income Canadians aren't going to cut it now for the types of problems that we're facing. So it's become a partisan issue where people, particularly we've seen an upswing in conservative voters expressing concern about cost of living.
Okay, back to the list, and you've got number 4 on your list as climate change. What are you finding there?
Well, what's really interesting about climate change is that we've stopped denying it for the most part. So in the past, where we used to have people on the left sounding the alarm and people on the right saying, I'm not buying it, now Canadians generally agree that we do have a problem with climate change, and where Canadians are disagreeing is in what to do about it.
I guess the notable exception is the People's Party of Canada, whose leader, Maxime Bernier, still does not believe in climate change, and that's his position. Back to your list, number 3, immigration. What's Polly saying on that?
With immigration, what's interesting is that most Canadians do agree that immigration is good for our country, unlike in the United States where there's a lot more negativity here. The concern is around mass migration, and we do see both a gender divide and a political divide, with conservatives expressing more concern about mass migration, the impact on cities and on services and on cost of living. A lot of the concerns about cost of living actually have to come out of the big urban centers and have to do with immigration, versus the people who say, no, we need to encourage more and more immigration because our birth rate is too low.
Number 2 on your list, perhaps not surprisingly, given how much we hear it discussed by the so-called resistance, the carbon tax.
Yes, carbon tax, a big political divide here. So Canadians agree that climate change is an issue. It's going to be a big issue in this election. What do we do about it? We see big divides regionally, by political party, by gender, by age. So this one is really dividing Canadians apart at all demographic and regional levels. People who are pro-carbon tax, generally on the left, and people who are against it in the West and on the conservative side.
Okay, Sheldon, don't put number 1 up yet. I want these guys to have a guess at what you think number 1 is, because we've talked cost of living, climate change, immigration, carbon tax. What one issue out there not heretofore mentioned do you think would be number 1 on the list of concerns for Canadians right now? Shout it out, either one of you. I'll tell you what, I was shocked to see
I'm
this.
surprised because I thought it would have been something related to cost of living.
Precisely.
That's what I was going to guess.
Precisely.
Housing.
Interesting. Okay, put it up, Sheldon. Here we go. The number 1 thing Polly is discovering? Refugees. Jeez. Refugees. Okay, help us out with this, Erin.
So this is a measure, these are measures of partisan issues. So it's not the number 1 issue being discussed by Canadians. That is actually cost of living. But refugees are the ones that are dividing people the most, with people on the left saying we are concerned about refugees, we need to let more refugees into the country, and people on the right concerned in particular about illegal refugees, that we're not doing security checks, that they're not being properly integrated, that they might not have the skills to integrate into society. So these are really partisan issues that we're looking at here, the things that divide Canadians the most. Refugees does have high engagement. Cost of living and jobs has the highest engagement, as with most elections.
Andrew.
What you've seen between the two major parties over the last weeks and months is on a number of these issues is of them narrowing their differences rather than expanding them. So on refugees, for example, the Conservatives were firmer on saying, well, we've got to deal with this problem at the border. We have to reopen the safe third country agreement with the United States. And the Liberals were poo-pooing that until the last budget, in which they suddenly brought in a measure saying we're going to turn people back even if they've crossed the border, if they've made a claim elsewhere. On the deficit, for example, the Conservatives were hammering the Liberals, you've got to balance the budget. Suddenly, as we get closer to the election, the Conservatives say, well, we're going to wait 5 years to balance the budget. So what tends to happen as we get closer to elections is that far from sharpening their differences as parties, maybe their partisans on social media, et cetera, are going at each other hammers and tongs, but the parties themselves tend to move towards the middle being defined by whoever's had the better of the argument. So the Liberals had the better of the argument on the deficit. The Conservatives had the better of the argument on refugees. I don't mean in some objective sense, but in terms of where the people were, where the public was going. And so each of the parties saw it prudent as the election approached to cut their losses and move towards each other.
Even having said that, Tony, I would not have guessed that refugees and what to do about them would be the most divisive issue facing Canada today.
Well, it doesn't surprise me though, because even though I said, as we read off the top of the show, that there's this big middle in Canada and not a lot of light. If you look at American politics, what's the issue that Donald Trump has most been able to use to polarize the electorate or to capture the polarization of the American electorate? This has been it, the sense that there's something wrong with the border, that too many people have entered, that they're entering too easily. And at the same time, the Democratic Party, a large chunk of the Democratic Party in the United States, is saying, hang on, actually what we want is we'd like to decriminalize border crossing. We'd like to make it easier for people who are already in the United States in a not legal status to become citizens. So the two parties are actually drifting further apart in the States, not coming closer together, because there is a really sharp division, left and right, on broader questions of immigration and refugees.
But that's there. That's there in a country that shares a border with Mexico. We've had, our experience, Andrew, with this can't compare to the American example.
That's absolutely right.
And yet it's still a big issue here, apparently.
But certainly not nearly as big an issue as in the United States. It's perennially in Canada something of an issue amongst a certain section of the electorate. What we've seen is actually polarization around immigration has gone down over the last few decades. That as the numbers have come up, as the proportion of the population that is foreign-born has come up, we've actually seen a lessening of tensions around this question, relatively speaking. So familiarity tends to breed respect rather than contempt. What's noticeable about the United States is they have a much larger percentage of the population that lives in areas where they would really not have much contact with refugees and with immigrants. In Canada, we're so heavily urbanized, we have much larger percentage of our population that knows people who've come here from somewhere else and aren't as upset about it.
And there's such a big difference between Canadian and American immigration. Canadian immigration has been overwhelmingly legal, orderly, and kind of just boring. People come here and you sort of just forget that a year ago they weren't here. In the United States, so much of the flow of immigration has actually been people just walking across the border and staying. And the legality versus illegality in the two countries drives a lot of people in the United States crazy. There isn't that same push in Canada, the exception being what's gone on at the border at Lacolle, Quebec, which again is not people crossing, it's complicated, but they're coming and they're trying to claim refugee status under the legal refugee system. Nevertheless, there are some people that has really upset. So I think that's why we're seeing a bit of it in Canada. That would be my guess. That if you did this 5 years ago, I'm guessing you wouldn't have seen the same thing about refugees being so polarized.
But people have tried to play to that. You saw in the Conservative leadership race, Kelly Leitch, for example, didn't really do very much for her. That doesn't seem to have done very much so far for the People's Party. We'll see as we get into the heat of an election campaign. The Conservatives have pushed on it a bit, but they're always careful not to go too far. And to the extent that they have gone too far, they've been called out and they pulled back. So I think it's always tempting for people to demagogue that issue, but in Canada, I think there are still limits on how far you can push it.
Let me explore, and Erin, I'll go to you first on this, a series of questions. And listen, we'll just take this off the Toronto Star weekend paper. Here was the headline: Leaders court two Torontos, one with money to burn and the other clinging by its fingernails, which really suggests, I guess in some respects, if you've got money and you're okay, climate change is an issue you have the luxury of feeling very deeply and worrying about. And if you don't, cost of living and income inequality is something that you spend a lot of time worrying about. Erin, I wonder what does Polly see in terms of the different ways this issue manifests itself in your data?
Polly is seeing a huge increase in engagement on cost of living issues, particularly among people 24 to 35. So in that age group where they're buying houses, getting married, possibly having children, and in people 55 plus. Those two age groups have grown the most, but it's grown across every age group, both men and women, and across every region, but of course particularly in the big urban areas. And we're seeing it tied to questions about mass immigration and refugees, people who feel that we've let so many people into the country that it's driving up rent in major urban areas. I'm not saying that's true, that's just the public opinion. And as I said, people are concerned that the governments, the parties that are running, are not addressing the particular issues that they're feeling, that a lot of the programs are for lower income Canadians, and we're really seeing more of this conversation among the better off, the middle class, so to speak, that they're having problems with older people saying they're worried about their children being able to afford a home in Vancouver, GTA, and in Montreal. So it's definitely a huge issue, and it's clouding our other policies. As we said earlier, people are positive about immigration, but they're worried about the effect on cost of living.
Do you see that split not just in terms of class, but also in terms of where people live, urban versus rural, for example?
We're seeing it more in the urban areas and in areas that are hard hit by, in Alberta, for example. British Columbia, we're seeing a lot of it. So it's more in urban areas, less in the rural areas, places where there's high population and big competition for services.
Gotcha. Andrew, let me bring you in on the Indigenous issue. In the last election campaign 4 years ago, Justin Trudeau said there was no more important relationship to him than improving the relationship Canada has with Indigenous people. He's had some wins, he's had some losses over the last 4 years on that. I think we can say it has been a lot more difficult and controversial than he expected. Has that relationship been too divisive for him to campaign on this time around?
It's a complex issue, and there's divisions within different communities. What I think we've become more and more conscious over the last few years is there's divisions within Indigenous groups around things like development, pipelines, et cetera. There isn't some sort of monolithic view, which of course just means they're like everybody else, but, there's division within that. I think there was also, he's discovered on this issue, as on a lot of other issues, that it's a little more complicated than just issuing promises during election campaigns. Remember, he took the Truth and Reconciliation report with all of its 94 recommendations and just instantly said, we're going to put them all into effect.
Sight unseen, he did.
Yeah, and that's great if you can do it, but it's certainly proved to be a lot more difficult. I think the danger is partly that expectations get raised, and as expectations get raised, if you don't deliver, that can heighten tensions around these issues. And part of why you may not be able to deliver on some of these issues is you may not be able to get buy-in from the rest of the community. And as I say, there are divisions amongst Native leadership around which way to go on some of these questions. And we have, I think, a bit of a governance problem when you have the Assembly of First Nations, where the leader of the Assembly of First Nations is not elected by the population at large, but by the chiefs. And that gets you into some rivalries in politics that make it hard to get consensus on some of these issues about where to go forward. For example, everybody agrees we need to get rid of the Indian Act. Everybody. As soon as you start talking about getting rid of it, nobody can figure out and nobody can agree on exactly what should replace it.
The how and the when is tough on that one. Yeah. Tony, let me go to you on social conservatism. Yep. We have, once again, in this admittedly young campaign, already come across examples of things you apparently can or cannot say on issues such as abortion or same-sex marriage. How does that play out over the course of this campaign?
So that one's interesting because it seems to me that it's the Liberals who have brought it up. It's not the Conservatives who have brought it up to say, let's rally our troops by bringing up these sort of social conservative issues. It's Liberals who brought it up to say, we accuse you, Conservatives, of hiding some social conservatism in your party that you'd rather not talk about. So that is it's an interesting example of polarization in perhaps a different way than you'd expect. It's not sort of someone trying to bring up a polarizing, it's someone trying to bring up a polarizing issue that they think someone else has.
Yeah. And the Liberals are doing it as opposed to the Conservatives.
Yes.
Erin, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't see abortion as, we've looked at that issue. It's not grabbing people. It's really not, I don't think that's a winning platform for the Liberals to poke that issue.
So they're trying to make it a wedge issue, but so far you're not seeing it have any traction. Is that it?
Not at all, not at all. And when you compare it to climate change, cost of living, immigration, abortion's it's not getting a pulse.
But sometimes these issues have resonance beyond the issue itself. I think this is partly just to simply sow doubts about Andrew Scheer. He's not well known to Canadians. You can create an aura around him for whatever reason, that he's scary or should make you nervous in some respect. Then even if the people aren't that exercised about the issue itself, they can still have resonance.
Gotcha. Well, you have the floor. May I quote you to you?
You may.
Thank you. Seldom have the choices been so stark or the stakes so high. The two main parties, after all, could not be more different. The one, is well known, is little more than a personality cult centered on a leader, while the other is a personality cult minus the personality. The first is notably bereft of any governing philosophy or principles, but will say and do whatever it takes to win, while the second will say and do whatever it takes to lose. I got to say, Brother Coyne, that's well written. Well done. That was good. Why in this, you touched on it earlier, but let's just dive a little deeper here. Why do you think our political parties seem to have so little interest in being more significantly defined differently from one another now?
And you say now, because if you go back to the 2015 election, there were pretty significant differences. The Liberals had quite a radical platform in 2015, and maybe as we start to see more of the platforms, we'll see more differences, but it seems like this election, there's much less. It varies from election to election, but certainly, generally speaking, politics is about, quote unquote, the median voter. It's about a battle for the center ground. I think sometimes people in politics too easily accept somebody else's definition of where the middle ground is. It seems to me success in politics consists in defining where the middle is, and you can move the middle if you are a successful advocate for your causes. The Liberals have moved the center ground of Canadian politics, I would say, significantly to the left over the last 4 years, and the Conservatives have had to sort of grudgingly follow along. So they might not like it, but they're probably not going to repeal much of the stuff that the Liberals have done. They've redefined where the center ground is. But nevertheless, you have to remain somewhere within sight of it. That's true of our politics. What is less true in some other countries right now. I would say in the United States right now, the political parties, for various reasons, are more divided, more polarized than the population is. Mm-hmm. In Canada, arguably, our parties are less polarized, and up to a point, that's a good thing. So I do like to see differences between the parties, but you also want to see the parties making some effort to hold the polity together, to keep us within hailing distance of each other.
Where are you on that, Tony?
So I think Andrew's right that politics is often about defining where the median is. The Liberals did move the median in 2015, and the Conservatives are struggling to deal with that. I think Conservative parties across Canada are having a struggle to deal with the question of how do they balance their desire to make government smaller with the problem that a lot of voters like many of the things that government do, healthcare at the top of the list. So they've had to offer voters this difficult to manage, difficult to balance message of we are going to make government smaller, but we're going to somehow do that without making government smaller.
That's right.
And that is a very difficult sell. So I think I think this is a challenge more for Conservative parties at the moment than for the Liberals and the NDP.
They've been winning government provincially, but they've been doing so at the expense of certainly the conservatism that I grew up with. So when you think back of when conservatism used to be about free trade and deep tax reforms, and remember when the Reform Party came in about radical reshaping of the government, conservatives seem to have given up on that for now in any substantial way. They're much more incremental, they're much more small ball. And whereas on the left, the parties seem to be gathering in confidence and making much more radical, and I say radical in a perfectly neutral sense, calls for things like pharmacare and expanding, dental care, and on identity politics issues, being quite radical in some of the measures they're prepared to entertain there. So the left really has more of the wind at its back ideologically these days, even if the Conservatives have been winning some elections. That
dovetails us nicely into some discussion about populism. And I wonder, Erin, let me get you back in here at this point. As you survey Canadians with Polly, does it look like there's a kind of a brewing Ford Nation takeover of the country in the works here?
Oh, there's definitely not a Ford Nation takeover in the works. No, I think, in fact, what we're seeing in this election, the reason why you see less radicalization or less big ideas coming out of the Conservatives is because they're trying to distance themselves a little bit about what's going on in Ontario, because there is some fatigue there for sure, and there's some concern that a Conservative Party would bring in the kind of cuts that have been seen in Ontario. we're not seeing that populism is a concern in Canada. Definitely partisan issues are on the rise, and there is more partisanship among the electorate, perhaps not with the political parties, but among the electorate, but still overwhelmingly positive on these issues, whereas in the United States, because we're watching them as well, they are overwhelmingly negative. You have more people making negative comments than positive in the United States. In Canada, it's still 60 to 70% positive. It's just that the negative comments are on the rise, significantly on the rise, and the partisanship is on the rise. Well, so we do have to be aware of that.
I am going to go with this one more time, because if we were having this conversation a little over a year ago, with Doug Ford winning a majority government, and with more conservative governments appearing across the country, including one in Alberta, with populism breaking out all over the world, we might have said or we might have speculated as to whether or not we were next in Canada with a populist outburst. Do you see any evidence for it coming now?
Not a great deal. And one is careful at saying this because one doesn't want to be accused of complacency. But if you look at the Ford victory, first of all, they won in spite of him, not because of him. They won because people were bound and determined to get rid of the Wynne government. And when I look at Ford, he looks to me much more like an old-fashioned bunkum artist than a new-style populist. He's not in the same vein as Donald Trump or the ones we see in Europe. I think we always have to be wary, but we have not gone through the same kind of serial traumas that the United States and Europe have gone through. We haven't had the same kind of experience with terrorism. We've had our brushes with it, but nothing like the same types of attacks they've had. We didn't have the same trauma of Iraq or Katrina or the financial market collapse. I mean, we had our brush with it again, but we got through pretty lightly through that. We haven't had a housing market collapse, knock on wood. So we haven't gone through the kinds of things that have tended, rightly or wrongly, to discredit elites in these societies. We haven't had the same experience with immigration and refugees that they've had, that have tested the bonds of citizenship and made people afraid, et cetera. So for now, because we haven't gone through that same experience, there seems to be much more willingness still to trust the media in Canada. Believe it or not, there's
Heaven forfend.
There's data on that. To trust in government, to trust in the people who know stuff actually know stuff. There seems to be still that feeling remains in Canada, and let's hope it continues.
The other big difference between Canada and the United States is Donald Trump. You know, great. I don't want to engage in sort of pure great man theory of history here, but the man does make a difference. He has managed to crystallize a whole bunch of the things that Andrew mentioned into himself, and then he has transmorgified them into something else. So Donald Trump weirdly ran as actually a moderate on policy. Donald Trump was there saying, I'm not going to be like other Republicans who are scaring you that they're going to take away your Social Security or they're going to rip up Obamacare and replace it with nothing. He actually said, I'll come up with something better than Obamacare. We're not taking away your social programs. Also, I'm very, very racist. So he ran on this very...
I'm not sure he said that, but
well,
he is that, but he didn't say it.
His signal to his voters was, I'm going to focus on race issues. I'm going to focus on immigration issues in ways that conservatives have been afraid to. But at the same time, on conservative economic policy, I'm actually going to soft pedal that. Yeah. That was his message. What he's delivered has been a giant mess on both of these stories. But nevertheless, he ran as a certain kind of polarizing figure, but it wasn't on these economic issues. Yeah. It was on race questions.
We got a couple of minutes left here, and I want to touch on one more thing. And to that end, Erin, I'll get you in here on... Here's Donald Savoie, the New Brunswick political scientist who's been a guest on this program many times in the past. He's got a new book coming out called Democracy in Canada. And here's what he says. Political parties are little more than election day organizations. Political parties have been deinstitutionalized in that they have lost both status in society and their institutional character. Political parties have lost their brand to their leaders. On all important issues that confront Canadians, political parties are empty vessels. Okay, Erin, come in on that.
Well, I think largely that's true. You know, if the political party brand were stronger, people would understand. They'd be voting on the platforms and the issues as opposed to being sucked in by scandals and by individual personalities. So largely that is true, and I think that's why we're seeing frustration in the electorate. But I think people are still incredibly engaged. As I mentioned, twice the number of conversations now on political issues than we saw in 2015. And so people are concerned, they are engaged, and so I think that's positive.
Sounds to me, Andrew, based on the excerpt I read of your piece earlier, that you're kind of on side with that.
I think it's exaggerated a bit.
Okay.
I mean, I was having fun with the fact that they tend to move together come election time, but there nevertheless is some power in the brand. If you look at the polling data, people tend to trust conservatives more on spending and tax issues. They tend to trust liberals more on the environment or on health care. So these things have enduring, whether they deserve either of these reputations is another matter, but they do have an enduring brand. But I also agree the leader has become an obsessive focus for all of our politics to our cost. I think a lot of that is rooted in the way that we choose the leaders. You look particularly at the Liberal Party, where Justin Trudeau was elected by people who weren't even Liberals. They just were people who signed up to vote on that particular day. So we elect our leaders by an electoral college that disappears the day that they've been chosen. And they're therefore afterwards essentially accountable to nobody within their party until they submit to a review 4 or 5 years later.
Okay,
I think, but let me just follow up on that. I think that the party leaders have come to dominate their parties. It's pretty clear that's what's happened. That said, the party brand is still very, very strong. And I suspect that if you asked a lot of liberals and a lot of conservatives, should we be running this election on Team Trudeau or Team Liberal? They'd say, no, run on Team Liberal. It's the leaders who have taken over the marketing, the face, the focus. But the truth is, the party brand in some cases is still quite strong.
Well, whether you call it Team Trudeau or whether you call it Team Liberal, according to Polly, admittedly, early days in the election campaign, the current projections are Liberals winning somewhere in a range of 135 to 199 seats, Conservatives 108 to 164, so Liberals in first, in other words, NDP somewhere between 7 and 43, Greens somewhere between 2 and 4, and the Bloc Québécois somewhere between 9 and 17, the People's Party with nothing so far. We're not married to this stuff, though, right, Erin? This can change.
Oh, and yes, absolutely. And that's why we don't start to make a prediction until we see Polly's confidence level come down within 3%, and we're not there yet, and a lot can happen. I'm sure a lot of the parties have plans up their sleeves for changing public opinion, but as it stands right now, the Liberals are in the lead for sure.
Early days, everybody, early days. That's Erin Kelly, the CEO of Advanced Symbolics, Inc. We thank as well Andrew Coyne, columnist with the National Post, and Tony Keller, the editorial page editor of the Globe and Mail. Great to have all of you in at TVO tonight. Thanks, you.
Steve. Fun.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.